Red Podcast, episode 247, part 3 of 3 of my book launch trilogy. That's coming up.
This is the Red Podcast. Here's your host, David Hooper.
David Hooper, Red Podcast, the podcast for experts. If you're a blogger, speaker, marketer, podcaster, author, somebody with a message to spread, I'm going to help you spread it. I'm going to help you build an audience, get connected with that audience, and make money with your message. This is part 3 of my trilogy for Jeff Sanders' book, The Free-Time Formula, talking to Jeff about signing the contract, what happened during the middle of the process, and this episode, we're talking about launching the book. If you haven't heard the first 2 episodes, the first one, right after he'd signed the contract, this was after he told me he would never, ever sign another book contract. That's redpodcast.com 245. The second part, that's right after he'd finished his manuscript, redpodcast.com/246 for that. And this one, I'm going to take you back in time, just a few weeks ago, as Jeff Sanders had just launched his book, The Free-Time Formula. Red Podcast, David Hooper here with the third in our trilogy with Jeff Sanders. The book, it's called The Free-Time Formula. I've got it in my hand. The subtitle, Finding Happiness, Focus, and Productivity, no matter how busy you are. And Jeff, you've got to have been busy launching this book.
I have been, yeah. It's amazing how much work it is to launch a book. I think it's definitely probably 3 or 4 times more work to launch it than it is to write the thing. So, yeah, it's a lot to do.
You know, I found when I'm writing a book, I think, oh man, I can't wait to get out and market it. And then when I'm marketing a book, I want that downtime. It's like, man, I sure wish I could have a little downtime to go write a book.
Yeah, I mean, I wish in many ways like it was kind of the old school way of doing books where you could just like be an author, write a book, and then just kind of give it to the publisher and walk away. But that world doesn't exist, if it ever really did. And so I think that in many ways you can't, like I can't think of myself as just a guy who sometimes writes books. It's like I'm a guy who markets a lot of stuff, and in my free time I'll write a book or two. And so it's a big difference in that mentality there.
I want to get to that because you've got a publisher on this, Wiley. I'm going to talk later on with you about what they're doing compared to what you're doing as far as this goes. But let's start with the foundation of the book. How will you know that this book is a success?
Well, I guess it depends on who you ask. I know that my publisher has like sales numbers that they want to see with the book. I never really gave myself any specific sales number I wanted to hit aside from hoping that it would sell more than my first book did. Really, for me, knowing this as a success in that sense really is about saying that my audience that I've been, tucking it up to for a while, that they are going to get their hands on this and hopefully to expand my audience because of this book. And so to that degree, I have like an email list. I have a podcast following. I have people that are kind of a part of, the Jeff Sanders brand, so to speak. And I would like to see that audience grow because of this book being a part of that, that presence there. To say that I have a specific number for all those, I mean, I don't really have one. I know that right now I need to push a lot harder to get more sales. But other than that, it's hard for me to say success versus no, because at this point, I think it's still too early to tell. 6 months from now, I'll probably have a really clear idea of what that looks like. At this stage in the game, I feel like I'm just getting started in a lot of ways. So I think we'll see how this thing plays out.
You mentioned something that took me back to my days in the music industry, in that you've got your current audience, but you're also looking to expand your audience. And with a band, for example, you've got the hardcore fans that have been with you forever, and they want something that sounds like they're used to. But sometimes to expand that audience, you've got to go for that pop hit, that single. Do you feel that this book is more for your current audience, or you mentioned expansion? Is it more to grow that audience, or how did you mix the two things together?
Well, I think in terms of like the content overall, the book is fairly similar. And the way that I write the book, the way that it's built with action steps and productivity is kind of like a central theme. So to that degree, the book is largely for my current audience. But at the same time, I think the way that it's being marketed as a book that's, for people who want to have more free time, that's a very different spin than somebody who wants to get more stuff done. And so to that degree, I think that the kind of target reader for the book is different than my current audience. And so hopefully to that degree, I can expand out to get some more people that, want to kind of, they get bought in on the idea of having more free time, but then they stick around with the rest of my brand to also figure out how to get their goals accomplished and how to really dig into the rest of my content. And so to that degree, yes, I want to expand out based on that niche of saying like this book is, in an ideal sense, targeting someone new.
This is your second book on a publisher, but not with Wiley. You had a previous publisher on the last one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how the launch of this book differs from the launch of the last book. What did you learn? What maybe should you have learned that you're wishing you would have changed? How are things different?
Well, I think that one thing that I didn't realize until probably way too late in the game was the focus that, my new publisher, Wiley, has on who they believe to be an author. We had a nice long talk a few weeks ago about this whole topic because I think it just dawned on me that a publisher like Wiley, which is like kind of a big box kind of publisher, they are looking for authors who already have, first of all, a large following, and secondly, that they are doing lots of public speaking. And I didn't realize kind of the emphasis on that because my angle so far has been much more internet business marketing. So it's podcast followers, email subscribers, Facebook leads, and that's not kind of their methodology. Not that necessarily the internet business method isn't successful or effective, like it can be, but I think that what's interesting is that they, in their experience at Wiley, have seen more success over the years with people who are kind of out hitting the streets and speaking to lots of audiences every week, which my business model hasn't put speaking that center stage yet, so to speak. And so I think looking back at it, I wish in many ways the last couple of years that I would have leveraged public speaking a whole lot more to lead up to this. And so that's one thing I'll definitely have to do for the next book to make sure it even happens and to make sure I can get kind of more sales that are centered around an audience that comes to hear me speak.
What would that look like? So you want to speak more. I guess that's the goal. The goal from speaking more is to sell more books. How are you in the process of setting that up?
At this stage, I'm still kind of debating between how to get some, I'd say like I'm looking for some kind of a company to work with to kind of market me. There's a lot of options out there for those, everything from a PR rep to a speaker's bureau. Sometimes those are effective, sometimes they aren't. I'm still debating how I want to actually set that up. But I know that that's going to be a major focus of mine going forward, is getting as many people on board as I can to help pitch me as a speaker. I'm not actually the best person to do that most of the time. I'm actually pretty terrible at pitching myself. That's a focus for me as far as an area of growth is concerned. I know that once I get gigs, I can get more gigs. That's happened in the past very easily. So it's just a matter of kind of getting that ball rolling if that's going to be my focus going forward. That's the transition that I'll be making, is kind of scaling back what I'm doing on kind of the website end of things to work more into marketing myself as a speaker.
What have you done online to get the word out? Talk about the build up to this book, maybe even how it compared to the build up of the last book and how this is different from the last one even.
Well, with this one, I was pretty intentional about having lots of emails that went out to my list months in advance, kind of priming them for the sale of the book. I had many episodes of my podcast that were specifically about the book. I just finished a series of episodes, probably 6 in a row, where I was just talking about these various topics in the book and doing lots of priming there, mostly because my podcast audience really is my largest following and kind of my most passionate people as well that want to learn more from me. So there was a large focus on podcasting buildup that was much more intentional than the last book. And so far, that seemed to have done pretty well. I think the podcast listener crew tend to be those who buy books as well. A lot of them want to buy the audiobook, which is still a work in progress, so that'll be happening later as well. In that sense, the buildup was more intentional. The actual launch of this book also was more targeted. It happened basically on a single day. The book is going to be available. Here you go. The last one was more of a rolling launch. So over the course of a couple of months, it slowly became available, more so than this one. And so this launch was much more of a build up. Okay, it's ready. Go get it, which I prefer. I like that a lot better because then it's much more of a sense of, okay, we got there now. We're here. Go get it, which I love. So I think looking forward to the next few books, I'd like to see that happen again.
Was the publisher interested in that? Because I know a lot of publishers, they like to hit big because if you hit a list, for example, New York Times, USA Today, that can sometimes get some momentum from buyers, build upon that. Was that something that they had suggested or just something different from the last one?
They didn't really mention bestseller lists, although that's obviously a strategy that they utilize and they would like to see kind of, a bunch of numbers all at once. Wiley put a strong focus on pre-orders. They really wanted to see a lot of people getting the book before it actually was released, which was a very different focus than my last publisher, who really didn't prioritize pre-orders. And so I think to that degree, that's a very big difference, because getting a book primed months in advance can be really effective for people who really love you and want to get your book anyway. It's a much harder sell, though, because the way that I saw it, people couldn't pre-order the Kindle version, which is a very common, purchase and a very popular version of the book. So to say that you can only pre-order the hardcover version, that seemed to be a limiting factor in getting pre-orders. So in the future, theoretically, I'd have kind of more editions available for pre-order if I can ahead of time.
Your publisher handled the Kindle version as well?
They did, yes.
Yeah, pre-orders, I feel like it's one of those things that, again, it gets back to sales because they've got a sales team and they say, well, here's a guy, his name is Jeff Sanders. They go to a store, he's got 1 million pre-orders. You're going to want to have this book in your store. And it builds upon that. At the same time, though, that's kind of that old school mindset. And you alluded to that, like how Wiley has been used to doing books. You get somebody, they're on the road, they're basically selling day in, day out, year in, year out. And that's what they know. Not necessarily the best way. It sounds like you've got a great podcast audience. They responded to it. You've got a mailing list as well?
Yes, I do.
How do you balance keeping the relationship with those guys and letting them know about your book? Because I've subscribed to podcasts, and I'm amazed how these hosts will just pound and pound and pound. I've got a book. If you like the podcast, you really owe it to me to get the book. And you need one for your car. You need one for your office. You need one to give. Buy 5 of them. And they'll hound them. And then I've also been on podcasts where the guy's like, yeah, I've got a book. And I'm like, what? You never mentioned it. So how do you find that balance?
Well, I definitely stay away from the just kind of being too annoying side of things. Although you should probably ask my listeners about too annoying. But I think that there's definitely the sense that I want to make sure they know that I have books available. Mostly because I feel that podcast listeners, if they're going to get anything from me, a book is probably the most likely thing to happen. Yes, they might buy a course from me. They might want to hire me as a coach. I mean, those things may happen too. But primarily speaking, if I'm going to pitch anything, pitching a book makes the most sense. So I do mention it fairly often. I'd probably say every other episode, at least, I'm throwing that out there and mentioning it. At least, here's the title, go get the book, here's the link. Just to make sure that if anybody tunes in that week, if they're new to me, they're at the very least going to know I am an author, I have books available. I feel as though if I don't mention it, I'm kind of doing a disservice to my listeners because, that's my primary audience and those are the people who are going to be most interested in getting a book. So I feel like I owe it to them at the very least to say something about it.
Kindle version is out, audiobook coming soon. Are you planning on doing a push similar to what you did for the print book with the audiobook, especially with your podcast, because those people are already listening to audio?
Yeah, I think in a way, like if I can get the exact, launch date for the audiobook, I will be doing a big push on that as well. I think that worked really well for my last book I also had basically a separate launch for the audiobook by itself. And that was really effective. And so I feel as like that will probably be a focus of mine. If things go well, it'll happen in the next couple of months. Once I have that, I feel like that's just such an easy way to promote something that people listen to podcasts will want to get it anyway. So I think that'll, yes, it'll happen.
When you talk about things going well, you're still in the production phase of this book?
I mean, in a sense, I'm out of that phase now. The audiobook, though, production-wise, is just getting started. They've changed companies, or the company that was doing the audiobook production for me got bought out, and so there's a bit of a delay, and there's some things happening there. So theoretically, it'll be moving forward a little slower than it should have, but hopefully very soon.
But you've recorded it?
No, I have not.
Okay. Okay. So when we talk about production, we're talking about you're going to get in the studio with a producer, or are you going to record it? What is that going to look like?
If things go the way that I hope they will, I'll record it by myself in my home studio where I am now. I haven't got the official word yet on what's been approved. I just know that an audiobook is going to be done. And we were just about to have those conversations when the company got bought out. And so the whole thing kind of stops right in the middle of the discussions. So basically, as soon as I find out, I will know, but it may be a delay. It
sucks to be in limbo. Let's take a side note on this. I've seen it happen throughout my years in the music industry where a label will fire somebody and it's your guy that they fired, or a label gets murdered like you're talking about. This thing is going to come out, right?
I assume so, yes.
Does Wiley have a push for audiobooks, or are they kind of old school, like you've got to buy the paperback, you've got to buy the hardback, we are a traditional book company? What do they feel about the digital, like the Kindle and also the audiobooks, the different formats?
They're very old school. There's no doubt about it. When I even mentioned the Kindle and audiobook versions, they kind of gave me this look like, what are you talking about? Like they don't really care, which is kind of fascinating to me. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing, because I mean, if they've been selling a ton of hardcover and print books, that's great. I just feel like the kind of business that I have developed and the kinds of people that I attract are the ones who want digital formats for their books going forward. I feel like that's going to be a focus that I will have to push myself to make sure that happens. But not to say that there won't be a large number of sales from print versions as well. I just feel like there has to be a real intentional push for the digital version, because so many people are making a switch and exclusively buying digital books or listening to their books. And so it just has to be available.
What part did the publisher play as far as launching this book, working with you on how to launch it? Did they say, yeah, Jeff, I think that's too aggressive, that's not aggressive enough? Talk about their feelings on your launch and what they're doing in addition to what you're doing as far as launching this book.
They basically have the mentality that any bit of marketing I could possibly do is going to be good. And so they've been encouraging me to basically do everything in my power to get the word out. Everything from buying ads to doing giveaways to launching podcasts to public speaking, like whatever it is I can possibly do to get someone to know the book exists, they're all for that. As far as what they're doing to market the book, they bought a few ads on Amazon to promote it. They've done a little bit of promotion with Barnes & Noble and some stores in New York City. Some specific things that they have connections to, they've pulled those off. But primarily, I mean, the responsibility is mine to market the book. Publishers are really there to make a book available, and that's kind of where they stop. They do some marketing, but not what it would take to actually, like, let's say, hit a bestsellers list or get a lot of sales. So to that degree, that's, as I just finished my second book, I'm realizing if I want to sell a lot of books, I mean, it's going to take my efforts and my own network to pull that off. And so going forward, I feel like I owe it to myself and my audience to make sure that I am developing that over time and never really expecting the publisher to do much at all.
Can you explain how the Amazon ads work?
Basically, they've bought some ads that are specifically targeted towards certain subcategories in Amazon. So if you're searching for a book, on productivity or on management or leadership, and you kind of are digging through the Amazon, lists of different categories, you'll see a little kind of list of books that are sponsored either above or to the right-hand side of the main list. You'll see like a sponsored section for those. And a lot of times it'll say who it's sponsored by. So Wiley tends to have their own brand name actually attached to their ads. And it'll say like, here's some top books by Wiley, get them now. And mine was featured in one of those recently. And so they're really just trying to target customers who are already on Amazon, already looking for a certain genre of books, but just kind of need a recommendation for which one to get.
So that's keyword based, or is that based, like, let's say I like the book Getting Things Done. And if there's a Getting Things Done book, maybe they could attach your ad just to that book specifically?
They could. To my knowledge, they have not done specific books like that. It's been much more category and keyword based. That's more like general categories of books. So not keyword based on titles. That is more specific. And they mentioned that I could do that myself. As far as their end, they bought the more kind of generic ads.
Yeah, of course you could do it yourself because you're paying for all that, right? Let's just be clear. This is your money. No wonder they don't mind you doing this work.
That is so true. It's funny to me too because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, if it's going to be a bigger publisher and they have a bigger network, it's going to be easier to get sales. But I think the real story here is that the bigger network that they have or the bigger company really just means the book will be available for sale in more locations. But that doesn't mean that it's going to sell. It just means it'll be available for sale in more countries or on more websites or whatever the case is. And so it still requires marketing. It still requires someone to say, hey, go get this book, as opposed to just it exists at all.
You mentioned Barnes & Noble, New York City. Is that like an end cap promotion where your book is facing out? You're not just on the shelf?
At Barnes & Noble, they've got kind of tiered categories of where you can buy various kind of chunks of space in their stores. I don't actually remember which one they got. It was probably the lowest tier, I'm sure. But whatever it was, it got a little like featured area in one of the stores that gets a lot of foot traffic, in an area where they see a lot of sales in New York City. And so to that degree, it's really just about picking like how much money do you want to spend to really make sure your book stands out. One of the options is kind of right when you walk into the store, there's a big splash right there. That's like the super high end model. But you can also get your book featured like inside of the category in that area of the store as well.
I would think the airport bookstores would be great for this book. Have you looked into that?
That is an option. We haven't yet pulled the trigger on that one. I personally would love to see this in airports because I think it'd be a great, easy book to pick up for that reason. It's an easy read, and the book, title theoretically is attractive enough that somebody who's a busy traveler, they probably would like the book. So yes, that's a goal of mine. We'll see when that happens. But it's a good idea, though.
Let's dive into the network that Wiley brings with it. I think that's why a lot of people would sign onto a publisher like Wiley or any big publisher. You think, I'm going to have access to other Wiley authors, for example, for all the blurbs that you've got here on the back. Did they help you with that, or is that also up to you?
That was all me. I did ask them for a couple of recommendations for people. Those really didn't go anywhere, so I just kind of leaned on my own network, which fortunately I had some people that said yes that I didn't think would do so. So that was helpful. But other than that, the endorsements were actually an optional component. I didn't have to do those at all. I just decided that would be kind of an easy way to fill the back cover and to get some recs of the book as well.
So you have a foreword in this book, which, if you're not familiar with a foreword, it's usually somebody who has maybe a bigger notoriety than you do, or somebody who's in the industry, and they write a couple pages and they say, this is a great book and here's a little something about it, and you've got one. I'm curious to know the story behind that, how you went after it. Did you have to go after multiple people?
Yeah, so basically the forward to get one was actually an optional part of the contract in the book. I thought it would be a good idea if I could get someone's name attached to the book as well, kind of beyond my own. And so I had some people that I had interviewed for my podcast. One of them happened to be a Wiley author who also was a number one New York Times bestseller. And so I thought, well, if this guy has, he has the recommendations in that sense, he's got the resume for it. Let me ask him. And he just said yes almost immediately. And so he was a really great fit. He also has written books about productivity. So the genre fits really well. And so that was very simple. I was the first person I asked. He said yes, and we got it going. Really surprised me. Turned out to be a really great forward as well. And so I think the whole process for that was surprisingly simple, and one that in the future probably won't be quite that easy. But it was really nice to be able to have kind of that sense of like, here's somebody else's thoughts about the book, and they were nice. So it was good.
So what did that process look like? You emailed him, Twittered him, Wiley set you up with a call with him?
I happened to have his assistant's email because I had done an interview on my podcast with him previously. So I just sent her an email and said, hey, I'd love to get a foreword written, by Kevin Cruz. And then a few days later, he said yes. And so it was just an email conversation at that point. And it was pretty easy.
A lot of people have endorsed this book. I did. And I know how you contacted me. I don't know how many people you contacted. You probably contacted more people than got back to you. What lessons do you have for somebody reaching out who wants an endorsement for the book, wants, as you say in the back, praise for the Free-Time Formula? Because those do help sell books at times if you know who it is doing the praise. How do you reach out to those people? And maybe more importantly, how do you get them to say yes and get you that praise in a timely manner?
It's tough because that's just a sales process by itself. And so I reached out to probably 3 times as many people as said yes. So I got lots of people that ignored me, lots that said no. Although the way I set it up was I basically said, like, don't reply to this email if the answer is no. Like, you can just ignore me. It's fine. And people did that quite a bit. So that was kind of funny. But I made like a very low pressure thing. Like, if you have a few minutes and you want to do this, I'd appreciate it. I'm not a high pressure kind of pushy guy in that sense. And I was asking people that already knew me and people that were likely to say yes because they've done it before, or they are authors themselves and they know how the process works. And so it was really just kind of making sure that I was asking the right kinds of people who were likely to give me something in return that I could use. In general, I think it worked pretty well because I was hoping to get, around 20 to 25 endorsements. And that's basically exactly what I got. Probably 75 to 80 people to get those numbers. But, that's what it takes sometimes.
Well, it seems like a great match. Like Matt Frazier is on the back, author of The No Meat Athlete, which I think we've talked about it on the previous couple of interviews that I've done with you about this book. Vegan. Also, I'll call you an athlete. You were trail running today, probably.
I was.
That's a great fit. And are these guys helping you to get the word out about the book? And I guess you have an excuse because you can at least email them and say, hey, man, here's your quote.
To a degree, yes. Some of the people in the back of the book probably are just too busy to really care that much about helping out my book do well. But I think it's just one of those, like, if you can get someone who has an audience that's a good overlap with yours. In the case of Matt Frazier, I've been on his podcast multiple times. Lots of his listeners also tune into my podcast. So he definitely has been very helpful. And he's a good example of someone who is happy to promote the book and has done a great job with that. Finding, partners in crime like that would be helpful. It's nice to be able to kind of give them a shout out in the back of the book and have that work. Think about it now. I should have had David Hooper in the back of my book. That would have been great. But other than that, it's like it is nice to have someone there who's a friend who's got a similar market that you can work from there.
Somebody told me, and I think this is an interesting trick for authors, you, me, when we're trying to get more attention to our book, that if you go to these people for blurbs, as we call them, praise, whatever, because you're not going to put the stuff that they don't like on there. It's always going to be praise, right?
Of course.
And if they're at the top, it shows up on Amazon, and they like to see their name on Amazon. So that's a great opportunity to get people simply because of that. Like if somebody has a new book coming out, it's going to say Jon Acuff, author of Finish, which is his latest book, because he's trying to let people know that he has a different book. And if somebody knows that name, they may not know that he's got the book from exactly what we just said. Sometimes people do not know that their favorite author, their favorite podcaster has a book. We simply miss it.
Yeah, I think it worked out really well with Jon Acuff because he literally he was about to launch Finish when I asked him about this, and I had just interviewed him for my podcast about that. And so that was good timing. And I think he actually said yes because he knew that I would put his name, on the book in that sense. And so it's helpful a lot of times to have the timing that works out that way. And you're right about the Amazon results as well. If you look at my book on Amazon, you'll see Jon Acuff's name like right below that because he was the first person listed as an endorsement. And I think that kind of marketing goes a long way to get someone to say yes to you if you're asking for a blurb, because you can in a lot of ways feature them. Of course, on my sales page, I have different excerpts from people as well, and Jon Acuff's one of those also. So it's really just kind of figuring out kind of who you can market, as long as you're kind of hoping that along that process, they're going to help promote your book as well for you.
Yeah, Amazon just pulls from a database. So chances are that Jon Acuff quote, for example, it's going to be on Barnes & Noble. It'll be on Books A Million. It'll be more or less everywhere this book is sold. So it's great publicity for him. Who is this Jon Acuff guy? That book sounds interesting. So he could potentially get some sales off of this.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the idea. And that was partly, what I was hoping to get when I originally asked people for endorsements, was saying, like, I would love to kind of, however I can, kind of promote you and your work along with you giving me this blurb. And so it's really trying to figure out, like, what's the win-win going to be for each of us, because the more kind of joint marketing that happens there, I'm hoping that in the future, maybe some of them would ask me for a blurb on their book. And of course, I would be happy to do that for the exact same reason, so that I would get featured on their books as well. And so it's just whatever kind of makes the whole thing work, I think is worth pursuing.
So this trilogy that I mentioned, which this is the third part of it, you and I have had about a 10-month journey with this. It got you right after you signed the book contract, which was, strangely enough, right after you told me you would never sign another book contract. The second one, right when you're in the middle of it, I think you were done with the manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
And now, done with the manuscript, laid out in stores everywhere. What would you have to say to summarize all of this, if you could? Something that an upcoming author would want to know, something that you wish you would have known. I'll let you take this in whatever direction you want to. Go with it, man. You're a podcaster. You can do this.
I would say that, if anything, writing a book is a full-time job. You're probably not going to get paid a full-time salary to do it, but it is a full-time job to do the entire process. I mean, from the very beginning, kind of contract negotiations, or even if you started before then, pitching agents, pitching publishers, trying to start the process there. The whole thing takes, in many cases, months and years to pull together. This one just happened to wrap up basically in less than a year, which I think is actually surprisingly fast. But in that year, I have had to spend enormous amounts of time to get this thing pulled together. Everything like we discussed, from discussing the contract, discussing the title, writing the actual book itself, and then all of the post-production work and all of the marketing. It is an incredible amount of work that has to go into it. And so to that degree, it's like when you get to this final stage of wanting the book to sell well, in part, I just want to make back the money for the time I spent putting it together, let alone building my brand. You have to think about a book in many ways as this massive long-term project. If I want to sell this book 10 years from now, which I do, I would love to get royalty checks in 10 years for this exact same book. And for that to be possible, I have to go through kind of the laborious work today, hoping that the long-term benefits pay out. If I have multiple books and I have more speaking engagements and more products and build my brand bigger, these kinds of books can sell for decades. And that's my goal. It's really this massive long-term project. To that degree, I have to kind of get myself out of this, I want a paycheck now mentality, and more of, how am I growing the Jeff Sanders brand over time? And if this is working well and the book sells well over time, it will be successful then. That might be 5 or 10 years from now, but hopefully at that point, I can see the long-term impact of how it led to other opportunities. And, my first book deal led to the second book deal, and the second one could lead to a third one and other things from there. So if anything, it's hard being an author in more ways than I have realized in the past, but I think that the long-term benefits certainly are there.
I think you've approached this very smartly, though. When I ask you about how will you know if this book is a success, Wiley, on one hand, the publisher, they're looking at sales, but you're looking at it as brand building, getting connected with an audience. And it is a long-term strategy. And you said something else that I think is also interesting and worth saying, is that a book can literally change your life. There are people that have built careers on books. It happens, but you never know unless you go through the process, deal with editor, deal with the publisher if there is one, release it. And yeah, it's 10 months. That's it's impressive. I'm in the middle of a book right now that I'm about 4 years in on it. And yeah, it's coming soon. I swear. See, I don't have a publisher cracking that whip and deadlines. And that's the issue that I faced. And I think that's maybe another reason to go with a publisher. If you're one of those people that you feel like you need a deadline and a whip cracked and you don't have that internal motivation, because it is a lot of work, publishers breathing down your neck, I think that can help.
I mean, there's no doubt that was a big deal for me, because knowing that I had a specific deadline to shoot for, my entire life had to be completely reconfigured to make sure that I had space for the book in that time frame, which I know that I never would have done that exact same thing if I did not have that deadline that was imposed upon me. To the same idea we mentioned earlier of having brand building over time and not knowing if this book will be like the next big one. The author Stephen Pressfield, I've read many books from him, and kind of his life story was he wrote over 10 books before he got one to sell well at all. But once it did, all of a sudden he had this entire library of books you could buy from him that everyone loved. And so just this fascinating process of committing to a craft over a long time period, kind of in this hopes that things will work. I'm not going to be naive enough to think that I'll just write crappy books for a long time, but I know that there is a strong potential that, this book may not be a bestseller, but my 5th book or 10th book might be, and that may be worth it. And all the effort that led up to that was necessary to make those books do well. So, in many ways, I'm just getting started. There's a lot more kind of work to be done in that sense. And so I'm excited about the future.
Yeah, and it's exciting, right? Your greatest book is still in you. Your greatest podcast still in you. You don't want to be the Al Bundy of podcasting or book writing where you're talking about your glory days of high school.
Right, exactly.
Well, the book is fantastic. It's the Free-Time Formula, finding happiness, focus, and productivity, no matter how busy you are. And Jeff was able to do it in 10 months. It's a big project. That says something about how this actually works. Available, ftfbook.com, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get books. Jeff available at jeffsanders.com. And the podcast is excellent. 5 a.m. Miracle. It's about having an intentional day. You don't actually have to wake up at 5 a.m., but you can still have that intention. Maybe you have a 9 a.m. miracle.
Yes.
Like me. Well, Jeff, thank you for being here on Red Podcast. It's been fun over the last year. Might have to have this be like a thing. Like whenever you sign a book deal, I say, Jeff, what was different? We'll follow every single book from now on, because I'm sure there are going to be more.
Oh yeah, that's definitely my goal, and I think the same thing can be said about your process as well. I wish I would have known, 4 years ago you're working on a book. We do the exact same thing with you. Yeah. Well, it'd be like Roots or something. It would be like 13 nights in a row, 13 episodes. Well, yeah. It's a long process, but it's worth it. I've done, I don't know how many books I've done, 5 or 6 books. It takes me 4 or 5 years to do a book because of what you said, because of being so busy, but
I can tell you it's so great to have something kind of permanent when we are in a world of YouTube videos, podcasts, and what a lot of people kind of think is throwaway content. The book, it gives you some gravitas. It allows you to walk into a room, walk into those speaking engagements, and it's a business card. I don't use it quite like some people would use it as a business card, but it says like, yes, I'm established. And what's great about it, I'm sure your books are the same way, is that my last book came out 4 years ago, and I still get things about every week from people that really love it, and it's a great feeling.
Well, I remember even meeting you. It was at a conference probably 4 or 5 years ago, and you were talking about your book. And that's how I first knew you existed and wanted to learn more. And I think it's just because when someone says they have a book and it's about a certain topic you think is interesting, like you automatically trust that person and want to dig into their life a little more. And so to that degree, I think there's so much power in a book. But despite what you were mentioning, this idea of like, throwaway content, it's really good to have something that's kind of a solid foundation in your brand that you can really sell for years.
Yeah, well, definitely, because you and we are not people that just showed up on the internet or just showed up to podcasting because podcasting was hot. This is a long-term strategy. This is a career strategy. Me personally, I started in 95, and I will probably be going another 25 years because I like what I do. You've been doing this for a decade. You've been doing this for a while too. And the reason you haven't done it as long as me is because you're younger than I am. So you'll continue to go, and I love that. And along the way, you've got these milestones, and the book is kind of that moment in time of where you are, but hopefully good enough, like we were talking about, that it will last 5, 10, 20 years from now. But you can always go back and revise it, and I think the concepts are there, and it's strong. And the book is great, man. This is a better book than your last book. I know the next one is going to be even better, and definitely worth reading. So ftfbook.com. You've got some cool bonuses available and some other stuff if people are interested in making the most of their free time, getting up early, having intentional days, maybe being a meat-free athlete. It really all fits in that umbrella. We joke around about it. I'm vegetarian as well, but that helps productivity. And it's not just as simple as waking up and having a to-do list. It's a holarchy. And that's what we're talking about here, the podcast, the book, the mailing list. These are career builders. This is how careers are built. And the same thing with your time management. It's everything. It's eat, sleep, move.
I agree with all of that. I think it's definitely true. It's all connected. It's all amazing.
Well, Jeff, thank you for being here on Red Podcast. Looking forward to the next book, and we will chronicle that here as well.
Sounds great. Thanks, David.
That is it. Part 3 of my book launch trilogy with Jeff Sanders, writing and launching the book, The Free-Time Formula. Again, if you haven't heard the first 2 parts of this 3-part series, the first one, redpodcast.com, 245. That was right after he had completed his manuscript. That's available at redpodcast.com/246. Coming up, I'm in the middle of my own book process. For the last 3 years, I have been working on a book about how to market with podcasting. I wrote the book, as my first editor said.
It's just a big jumbled mess.
And it was. Had to rewrite the book. Then I had to rewrite the book again. The most recent revision, about the 5th revision, I think, I tore it down to its parts and rebuilt it from scratch. I should have it out within the next couple of months. Will I make it this time? Or will I have to do a 6th revision? I'm going to talk more about it. I'm going to be going in depth in the book writing and launching process. If you're interested in that, you want to subscribe to Red Podcast. Go to redpodcast.com, top left corner. There are links for you. Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music. I've got an Android app, an iPhone app. I've got an old school RSS feed. However you get your podcast, I will get Red Podcast to you. 1 click is all it takes. Go to redpodcast.com, top left corner. More on how to write and launch a book coming from me. Not interested in a book? Maybe you want a podcast. You might like my other podcast. It's called Build a Big Podcast. That one available at bigpodcast.com. So whether you're into the written word or the spoken word, maybe both, I've got you covered. That is coming up on Red Podcast or Build a Big Podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you soon.
You've been listening to Red Podcast. Never miss an episode. Subscribe now with your iPhone, Android, or via RSS at redpodcast.com.